Around the turn of the millennium, first-person shooters began to change. You had what is now known as the boomer shooter, which was fast-paced, pixelated, and generally chaotic, and required a lot of skill and was usually controlled with the mouse and the keyboard. You had the Half-Life series, which was quite linear and drove you from place to place in a heavily scripted sequence of events. And then you had the more cinematic military shooter with wide open spaces that generally tried to copy Saving Private Ryan. In the midst of this, you had a science fiction shooter that was released by a team called Bungie, and it was exclusively done for the consoles, which meant that it was controlled by the Xbox controller, which was a new device at the time. Now, I'm old enough to remember when Halo came out, and absolutely everybody had it. Everybody had the new Microsoft Xbox, and Halo was the game to play on it. Unfortunately, I decided that Pro Evolution Soccer was the game to play on my brother's Xbox, so I never played Halo back in the day. The aforementioned Bungie were a quality developer. They'd already developed Myth: The Fallen Lords, a real-time tactics game that was well received, and they'd also had success in the first-person shooter market for the Apple computers, with a series called Marathon that was exclusive to them. So I guess you could say Bungie were familiar with FPSs and also familiar with platform exclusives. The thing is, a lot of people think of Halo as an Xbox game, but that's not actually the truth. Halo Combat Evolved did come out for the PC, but I managed to avoid it for 20 whole years, and then I finally picked up the Master Chief Collection on discount, and decided, what the hey, it's 20 years old now, let's give it a shot and see what it's like. So the first hurdle I came across was that the game required a Microsoft account to sign in. Now I'm guessing this wasn't the case back in the day, and that this is another beautiful piece of modern gaming. Hooray! Blech. After doing that, I had to download the game as a piece of DLC for the Master Chief Collection. Once I'd finally got through these initial problems, I was actually able to play the game. The first thing you'll want to do when playing Halo on PC is hit tab. Why? Because Halo got a remaster in 2010. And it's bloomy, it's bright, it's colourful, it's completely different from the original design. And I feel that it was an attempt maybe to, copy the later Halo games, which I haven't played but I've seen screenshots of. It feels almost like retconning the original by replacing the stylized graphics of the time with things that are more modern but are now decidedly dated. It also feels like a strange halfway home between the original design and the modern ideal of what Halo is. One of the benefits that Bungie had when developing Halo was that the primary device that it would be played on had a set hardware specification. In this case, it was a 733MHz processor with the equivalent of a GeForce graphics card in there. As a result, this allowed the game to be much more cinematic in scope than had ever been seen before. You had these great sweeping camera shots of 3D environments, and it promised you were entering into a sci-fi epic, the likes of which Larry Niven would have envisaged back in the day. So after the Master Chief is revived from some sort of cryonic state, the first thing you have to do is learn how to move around. This sort of set the stage for future games where they would teach you absolutely every single thing that you needed to do over and over again and beat you over the head with it. But in this case, it's somewhat justified because this is one of those rare times where a first-person shooter came out on a console and was designed for a console controller. So you not only had to pick up the new style of movement, but also the control device that you'd be using to initiate that movement. As a concession to this control, Master Chief is slow. When first-person shooter games were on the PC, you would zip about like a race car. Moving at fast speeds was important. You needed to have really quick reflexes to not die. The one thing that Master Chief can do better than a lot of his first-person shooter contemporaries is jump. He's got a very good jump on him, he'd make Mario proud. The health system is a mix of regenerating shields and health packs. It's a halfway home between the old school style of fixed health that you had to bump up, and the new school style of I must just crouch here until everything regenerates. And like a lot of games that came after, if you get hit too many times, you'll start to hear your heartbeat in your own ears. And unfortunately, health packs aren't that numerous in the maps, so you could be listening to yourself ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum for a long time if you're not careful. One thing that the remaster didn't change in the 2010s was the level design, and that's a mix of twisting corridors and open spaces. But I'll get back to that later. It's just somewhat jarring to see when you've got this 2010s graphical design and it's combined with this early 2000s level design. One of the first things you'll notice about the game, based on the time it was released, is that it had big budget voice acting. Everything was voiced, and that was a big deal. Cortana's voice in particular was excellent, which makes sense since she's now the Windows operating system voice activation thing that I never use. Master Chief is literally a faceless blank slate of a protagonist for you to project yourself into, and that's fine. What people have to remember is that this Halo game, the first of a series, wasn't just a showcase of what Bungie could do, but a showcase of what they could do with this new Xbox hardware. It was a direct competitor to the likes of Sony and Nintendo, and Microsoft wanted it to take off and show that their console was the best. Much like Quake, which I talked about previously, Halo is more remembered for the multiplayer aspect than the single. Now, I never got an opportunity to play the multiplayer of Halo, but I've heard it's really, really good. So maybe this style of movement and weaponry and so on lends itself to a multiplayer scenario, and it might be fondly remembered because of the impact it had on the multiplayer scene for consoles. Another way in which Halo differs from its contemporaries is that the level length seems to be about 15 to 20 minutes each one, and areas are split up into several gigantic maps. This is ambitious. The developers realized that they had all this hardware capacity to take advantage of, and made huge levels in response. There are various checkpoints that you reach which cause an autosave, though you can save and quit within the Master Chief Collection, so it's not too bad. What is bad is that the remaster music has been absolutely butchered. It just doesn't loop properly. I don't know who was in charge of that, but it completely takes you out of the game, having a piece of music repeat itself like a stuck tape, rather than blending seamlessly in the correct tempo. Your initial enemies are somewhat surprising. It's set up as this big science fiction epic, and the enemies are somewhat cartoonish and hard to take seriously. They make funny noises and they waddle away if they take too much damage, and you're sort of thinking, this is the mighty Covenant? What? Where it makes up for this is the AI. The AI for the Covenant is superb. They will flank you, they will retreat as I mentioned, and in general they will pick up various weapons and other bits and pieces in the hope of defeating you easier. It's really excellent, even by today's standards. After the initial spaceship level, which serves as an extended tutorial, it's almost an open world shooter in the vein of Stalker, or at least it gives you that impression. This wide open, vast green space for you to move across. I can't imagine what that must have been like back in the day. Mind-blowing, I would suspect. I was also expecting it to be a lot more scripted than it was. You're dropped down in what's called a dropship, and you're expected to sort of go from one scripted sequence to the next, or at least that's what I thought. And in reality, that's not the case. There's a real sort of feeling of, hey, I can do anything I want here. So long as you get to the end of a level and where you're meant to be, the why and how of it doesn't exactly matter. And that's really cool of a developer to allow multiple ways for Master Chief to utilize the environment and the things in the environment to get to the level's end. The HUD that Master Chief has is a sort of map almost, and it detects monsters. And I thought like it was going to be a sort of quest location system where there would be various markings. It was a lot less handholdy and more open-ended than I expected. You really have to hunt about and use your wits to figure out what on earth you're meant to be doing next. One thing about the enemies that I didn't mention before is that a lot of them have shields, and this makes them very bullet spongy, which leads on to our next innovation of sorts from Halo. You can switch weapons and pick up weapons from corpses. Anyone who has a weapon and you kill them, you can pick up their gun and use it against their fellow Covenant allies. It's an interesting system, with your basic assault rifle being largely useless until later in the game, and the plasma weapons of the Covenant much better, though somewhat prone to overheating if you get a bit too feisty with the trigger finger. You also have a pistol, which is ridiculously overpowered, so I would suggest you switch to that and use it while you can. The spongy elements of the enemies that I was speaking about differs greatly from other shooters of the time, but it also forces you to search for new weapons, as ammo capacity is always a consideration. It's a different style and strategy, much like Master Chief's lumbering movement. The other thing that Halo introduces is vehicles. Now, there were technically vehicle sequences in other games, but in this case, they're seamlessly integrated. You jump on board a vehicle and you fly off, and sure, the controls aren't great in some of them, but they're still better than the Mako from Mass Effect in 2007, and I'm sure it's spectacular to watch in the multiplayer, and no doubt influenced the Battlefield series of games later. Clever usage of vehicles can also help you bypass areas entirely. Most people back then were used to the idea of Duke and Quake and Doom-likes, where you did a whole pile of damage very quickly and had to be careful with your movement. Halo was the opposite. Granted, because of Master Chief's movement speed, you also had to be careful with your movement in a different way, but the damage was very different. You didn't shoot and kill aliens with 1 or 2 hits. You had an entrenched bit of warfare where you fought against a clever AI, and it took more than a few seconds to take down even the most simple of opponents. And if they ganged up on you, they could do some severe damage if you stayed still for too long. Different weapons have different abilities. There's this spike thing that can set off grenades with homing shots. There are plasma things that are much better against shielded enemies than your assault rifle. And then there's the shotgun and assault rifle that are good against swarming low shielded enemies. In the space of 2 years, with the release of Halo and Call of Duty, the modern console shooter was more or less invented, for good or for bad. One thing I was surprised by was the lack of cutscenes. I thought this was going to be more narrative heavy than it was, the way that people talk about Halo lore. Sure, there are parts where there's extensive exposition, but there's also large stretches of time where you're not really told anything at all. Most of the storytelling is actually environmental. The humans mostly feel like generic military space marines. And while there is some degree of exposition, it didn't feel like enough for me. Unfortunately, the more I played Halo, the less I liked it. And the big problem was the level design. It was a combination of winding corridors and reused assets. You would go from room to room, and they would feel very, very samey. And it would be maze-like trying to navigate your way, to the point where the remaster actually added arrows on the floor to help you. I think Bungie acknowledged this, that this was one of the big flaws of Halo, so I feel somewhat mean-spirited pointing it out, but it is a glaring problem. The surrounding countryside had better level design. Medal of Honor Allied Assault came out the year after. Return to Castle Wolfenstein was around in 2001. And Half-Life and Unreal had already been out 3 years at this point. What became apparent with the level design was that there was a lot of tracking back. This makes sense, rather than reaching a level exit and the game being like, "Congratulations, it's complete." It just felt a bit cheap that you had to go through the entire level all over again. This all-powerful, super cryo-unfreezed hero of the people Master Chief started to feel a bit weak later in the game. On top of his weapons not doing enough damage, he was easily ganged up on due to his terrible movement speed. And the number of enemies started to increase exponentially, and because the AI of the enemies was so well programmed, it was a real slog trying to get out of places the enemies were pouring into. I feel like the game needed one or two more locations and a bit of level design touch-up, and it probably would have been an absolute classic to this day. If you look at the design of the swamp levels in particular, Bungie really knocked it out of the park there. The problem was, every time that they did this great piece of level design, they followed it up with a twisting, maze-like frustration fest. So, this is technically a spoiler. If you want to stop the video here, you can. Go and play Halo yourself, make your own mind up. The real bad guy shows up halfway through the game, and made my earlier notes that I'd made about the Covenant make a lot more sense. The Flood are zombie-like swarming hordes of enemies that behave completely differently to the previous enemies. And this is really clever, because it goes from you learning how to deal with the various Covenant forces to having to quickly switch to a completely different strategy. It's a wonderful moment and quite unnerving. And because you come across them in enclosed environments, they can be an absolute pain. Fortunately, this is where the assault rifle can actually be useful. I found myself mowing down swarms and swarms of the Flood with ease, and thanking myself for being able to find an assault rifle and a lot of generously placed ammo, thank you development team. So you're fighting your way out of this doomed place, and more Flood are swarming around, and they're fighting the Covenant. Now, monster infighting isn't a new thing, it was introduced in Doom years before, but it was really cool to feel like you were caught in the midst of two warring alien factions that turned against each other. It's such a reliable science fiction trope. Having a big bad enemy that you're fighting, and then having another, even more vast enemy come along and fight both of you. The environmental problems of the game peak in a level called the Library, which is infamous among the Halo community apparently, and I can see why, because it's very samey and you have to deal with lots of the Flood that are constantly respawning and there's just too many issues and too much tracking back in the later stages of the game that I'm not talking extensively about for obvious reasons. It felt like half the game was just you tracking back on yourself. The final levels of the game feel like a copy-pasted, rushed version of the previous parts of the game. Most of it is great. The presentation, the style, the story for the time, the environments, so much of it is done well, but so much of it is let down due to the need to cater for console movement and the map design in particular. Much like Quake and Doom and Half-Life, its influence outweighs the perception of the game itself. I would have loved to have seen more of the Flood, but with an Alien vs Predator style speed, where the Master Chief was zooming about the place and taking on these giant swarms of creatures. Then again, maybe that's what happens in the later Halo games. I haven't played them yet. At the end of the day, I can see why Halo was such a big deal back in 2001. Like, there are things here that are incredible for the time, truly incredible, but it's very difficult to go back to 20 years on. Having said that, I probably will play Halo 2, and if it sands off the edges that this one had, I might even make a video about it, even though it's much too modern for this channel. Until next time.